The stagecoach lurched violently as it hit another rut in the well-worn trail, sending Catherine Thornton nearly into the lap of the elderly woman seated across from her. Catherine steadied herself against the wooden frame of the coach, her gloved hands gripping tightly as she offered an apologetic smile to her traveling companion. Outside, the vast Colorado landscape stretched endlessly, rolling hills giving way to jagged mountains that pierced the azure sky. The year was 1875, and Catherine was traveling west to meet her future, a respectable banker named William Foster, who had been corresponding with her for nearly 8 months. Her parents had arranged the match, assuring her that William was everything a 22-year-old woman could want: stable, established, and most importantly, safe. Catherine smoothed the wrinkles from her traveling dress, feeling the letter from William tucked safely in her pocket. His words had been kind, if somewhat formal, describing the comfortable life awaiting her in Silver Creek. What she hadn't told her parents, or William, was that she wasn't seeking safety. The stifling propriety of Boston society had slowly suffocated her for years, and somewhere deep within, Catherine harbored a secret desire for something her mother would have deemed entirely inappropriate: adventure. Please subscribe to the channel. We'd love to know what city you're watching from. The stagecoach driver called out a warning as they approached Silver Creek, pulling Catherine from her thoughts. She peered through the small window, taking in her first glimpse of what would soon be her home. The town was larger than she had expected, with a main street lined with buildings that spoke of prosperity: a bank, several stores, a hotel that reached 3 stories high, and at least 2 saloons whose swinging doors seemed to welcome a steady stream of patrons despite the early hour. A church steeple rose in the distance, its white paint gleaming in the afternoon sun. This was to be her new life, mapped out and planned with the precision her father, a renowned Boston accountant, applied to everything. Catherine took a deep breath, trying to quell the strange disappointment that crept through her chest. Silver Creek was civilized, more civilized than she had imagined the West would be. As the stagecoach rolled to a stop before the Silver Creek Hotel, the driver opened the door and offered his hand. "Welcome to Silver Creek, miss. Watch your step now." Catherine descended from the coach with as much grace as her cramped limbs would allow, taking in the busy street before her. Men in suits mingled with roughly dressed miners and cowboys. Women in fashionable dresses walked briskly along the wooden sidewalks, parasols tilted against the harsh western sun. She was scanning the crowd for William, who had promised to meet her, when a commotion erupted from the saloon across the street. A man burst through the swinging doors, stumbling backward into the street. He was followed by another man, tall and broad-shouldered, with a thick gray beard that contrasted sharply with the vitality evident in every movement of his body. "I won't tell you again, Porter," the gray-bearded man growled, his voice carrying clearly across the street. "Pay your debts or don't show your face in my establishment." The man called Porter picked himself up from the dirt, his face contorted with rage and humiliation. "You'll regret this, Jackson," he spat before slinking away. The gray-bearded man, Jackson, watched him go, unmoving, a strange stillness about him that spoke of restrained power. Catherine couldn't look away. There was something magnetic about the man, something untamed that seemed entirely out of place in this otherwise orderly town. He didn't wear a suit like the bankers and businessmen on the street, nor did he dress like the cowboys with their chaps and spurs. Instead, he wore simple dark trousers and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up to reveal tanned, muscular forearms. A gun hung low on his hip, worn with the ease of long familiarity. As if sensing her gaze, the man turned suddenly, his eyes finding hers across the busy street. For one breathless moment, Catherine felt as though the distance between them had vanished. His eyes were a startling blue, not the pale blue of a spring sky, but the deep, intense blue of twilight. Then a voice called her name, breaking the spell. "Miss Thornton? Catherine Thornton?" She turned to see a well-dressed man approaching, his pleasant face creased with a welcoming smile. "I'm William Foster. Welcome to Silver Creek." Catherine accepted his outstretched hand, forcing herself to focus on the man who was to be her husband. But even as William led her toward the hotel, talking of her journey and the dinner he had arranged to welcome her, she couldn't help but glance back over her shoulder. The gray-bearded man was gone, as if he had never existed. William Foster was everything her parents had promised: polite, attentive, and unfailingly proper. Over dinner at the hotel's dining room, he spoke at length about his position at the bank, the house he had purchased in anticipation of their marriage, and the social circle that Catherine would soon join as his wife. "Mrs. Harrington, the mayor's wife, is most eager to meet you," William said, cutting his steak with precise movements. "She organizes a ladies' auxiliary that does charitable work for the less fortunate. I've taken the liberty of telling her you would be interested in joining." Catherine nodded, trying to summon enthusiasm. It sounded exactly like the committees her mother had insisted she join in Boston. "That's very thoughtful of you," she murmured, her eyes drifting toward the window that overlooked the main street. The saloon was visible from where she sat, its windows glowing with warm light against the gathering dusk. "The Silverado," William said, following her gaze. His voice had cooled noticeably. "Owned by Ethan Jackson, a remnant of Silver Creek's less civilized days, I'm afraid." Something in his tone made Catherine curious. "You don't approve of Mr. Jackson?" William dabbed at his mouth with a napkin before answering. "Jackson is a complicated figure in our town. He arrived here during the Silver Rush 15 years ago, made his fortune in the mines, then lost most of it gambling before opening that saloon. During the war, he fought for the Confederacy, a captain, I believe, though he rarely speaks of it." William's disapproval was evident. There are rumors about his activities during and after the war that are unsavory, but he has a certain influence in town, particularly among the miners and cowboys. Best to keep your distance. Catherine should have been reassured by William's concern for her reputation. Instead, she felt a flicker of irritation. "I see," she said, keeping her voice neutral. "And do these rumors have any basis in fact?" William appeared startled by her question. "That's hardly a suitable topic for dinner conversation, Miss Thornton. Suffice it to say, Ethan Jackson is not the sort of man that a lady such as yourself should concern herself with." The next morning, Catherine rose early, eager to explore Silver Creek in the daylight. William had arranged to meet her for lunch, giving her the morning to settle in and rest from her journey. Instead, she donned her simplest day dress and set out to see the town for herself. Silver Creek was bustling with activity. Wagons laden with ore rumbled down the street from the direction of the mines in the foothills. Shopkeepers arranged displays, calling greetings to passers-by. Catherine wandered along the wooden sidewalks, pausing to look in store windows and nodding politely to the curious glances she received. She was clearly a newcomer, and in a town this size, that made her an object of interest. Her wanderings eventually led her to the edge of the main street, where the buildings became more widely spaced, and the civilized veneer of Silver Creek began to thin. Here was the livery stable, a blacksmith shop, and she stopped, recognizing the building before her. The Silverado Saloon, stood at the crossroads where the main street met the trail leading to the mines. In the daylight, the saloon looked less intimidating than it had the previous evening. It was a substantial building, constructed of sturdy logs, with a wooden porch that wrapped around two sides. The swinging doors were propped open, and Catherine could see movement inside, as someone prepared for the day's business. She knew she should turn around. No respectable woman would be seen standing outside a saloon, let alone entering one. William would be horrified. Her mother would faint at the very thought. Catherine took a step forward. Just as she reached the porch steps, a man emerged from the saloon, carrying a crate of empty bottles. It wasn't the gray-bearded owner, but a younger man with a friendly face. He stopped short when he saw Catherine. "Ma'am, can I help you?" Catherine felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. What was she doing here? I'm sorry. I was just exploring the town and—" Her voice trailed off. The young man's expression was confused, but not unkind. "Well, we don't open until noon, and, begging your pardon, but this isn't really a place for ladies." Before Catherine could respond, another voice joined the conversation. "That depends on the lady, Thomas." The gray-bearded man, Jackson, appeared in the doorway. Up close, Catherine could see that he was older than she had initially thought, perhaps in his mid-50s. Lines etched the corners of his eyes and mouth, speaking of years spent in the harsh western sun. But there was nothing frail about him. He moved with the fluid grace of a man half his age, and those intense blue eyes held a sharp intelligence. "Miss Thornton, isn't it?" he said, surprising her. "William Foster's fiancée." Catherine nodded, wondering how he knew who she was. As if reading her thoughts, Jackson's mouth curved in a slight smile. "Small town," he explained. "News travels fast, especially when it concerns our esteemed banker." There was something in his tone when he mentioned William. Not quite mockery, but close enough to make Catherine's eyes narrow. "Mr. Foster speaks highly of Silver Creek," she said carefully. "He believes it has a promising future." "I'm sure he does," Jackson replied, his expression unreadable. "William Foster has always had a talent for seeing opportunity." Though his vision of Silver Creek's future might not include establishments like mine, he gestured toward the saloon behind him. Catherine sensed there was history between these two men, and not pleasant history. "Are you interested in a tour, Miss Thornton?" Jackson asked suddenly, catching her off guard. "Of the saloon?" Catherine blinked in surprise. The young man called Thomas looked equally shocked. "Boss, I don't think—" Jackson silenced him with a look. "Miss Thornton strikes me as a woman of curiosity and intelligence," he said, his eyes never leaving Catherine's face. "I imagine she'd like to form her own opinions rather than accept those handed to her." It was as if he had read her mind, seen through the carefully constructed facade of the proper Boston lady to the restless spirit beneath. Catherine knew she should politely decline and walk away. Instead, she heard herself say, "Yes, I would like that very much, Mr. Jackson." The interior of the Silverado was not what Catherine had expected. Yes, there was the long bar with its gleaming surface and the mirrored backdrop that reflected the light from the windows. There were tables for cards and a small stage where, Jackson explained, a piano player entertained patrons in the evenings. But there was also an unexpected cleanliness and order to the place, and a second room beyond the main saloon that housed a small lending library. Books? Catherine couldn't hide her surprise as she ran her fingers along the spines of volumes, ranging from practical guides to classic literature. Jackson watched her with amusement. Even miners and cowboys like to read, Miss Thornton, especially during the long winter months when the passes are snowed in. Catherine pulled out a well-worn copy of Moby Dick and opened it carefully. "This is a personal favorite," she admitted, "though my mother considers it inappropriate reading for a young lady." Something flickered in Jackson's eyes. Approval, perhaps. "Your mother sounds like a woman of conventional opinions." "My parents have very clear ideas about what constitutes proper behavior," Catherine said, replacing the book on the shelf. "They would be scandalized to know I was here." Jackson leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms. "And yet, here you are." There was a challenge in his words, though his tone remained conversational. Catherine met his gaze directly. "Yes, here I am." For a moment, neither spoke. Then Jackson straightened, gesturing toward another door. "There's more, if you're interested." The door led to a staircase, and Catherine hesitated. Going upstairs in a saloon with a man she'd just met went beyond impropriety. It bordered on scandalous. Jackson seemed to read her thoughts again. "My office," he clarified, "and the door will remain open. I believe I have something that might interest you." Curiosity won over caution, and Catherine followed him up the stairs to a surprisingly tidy office with large windows overlooking the mountains beyond the town. On the wall behind a massive desk hung a detailed map of the surrounding territory, marked with annotations. "Silver Creek and its environs," Jackson explained, moving to stand beside her as she examined the map. "The blue markings are water sources, the red are known silver deposits, and the green—" He paused, a shadow crossing his face. "The green marks are land claimed by the Northern Cheyenne before the government relocated them." Catherine studied the map with interest, noting how the town was positioned at the junction of several natural features: a creek, presumably the town's namesake, a valley that provided access to the mountains, and a natural pass that would have been the easiest route for travelers. "You've studied the land carefully," she observed. Jackson nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Understanding the land is essential out here. It can be either your greatest ally or your deadliest enemy." There was something in his voice that spoke of personal experience, perhaps hard-won knowledge from his time in the war. Catherine was about to ask about his experiences when a commotion from downstairs interrupted them. "Jackson!" a voice bellowed. "Get down here!" Jackson's expression hardened instantly, his hand moving instinctively toward the gun on his hip before he consciously stilled it. "Stay here," he told Catherine, his voice low and commanding. Before she could respond, he was gone, moving down the stairs with surprising speed and silence for a man his size. Catherine stood frozen for a moment, then moved to the top of the stairs where she could see what was happening without being easily visible herself. In the main room of the saloon, 3 men stood just inside the entrance. Their clothes marked them as miners, and their posture radiated hostility. The leader, a burly man with a scar running down one side of his face, stepped forward as Jackson appeared. "Porter sends his regards," the man sneered. "Says he's collected some friends who don't appreciate how you treated him yesterday." Jackson's stance was relaxed, but Catherine had the distinct impression of a predator ready to strike. "Porter should have come himself, instead of sending his lapdogs," he said, his voice deceptively casual. "Tell him his debt still stands. And if he wants to settle it like a man, I'm right here." The miner's face flushed with anger. "We ain't here to talk about no debt. We're here to teach you a lesson about respect." He lunged forward suddenly, swinging a meaty fist toward Jackson's face. What happened next unfolded so quickly that Catherine could barely follow it. Jackson sidestepped the punch with fluid grace, grabbed the miner's outstretched arm, and used the man's own momentum to slam him face first into the bar. Before the other two men could react, Jackson had drawn his gun and trained it steadily on them. "Now," he said, his voice deadly quiet, "you boys have a choice. You can pick up your friend here and leave, or you can join him in learning a painful lesson about manners." The two miners exchanged glances, clearly reassessing their odds. After a tense moment, they moved forward cautiously to help their dazed companion to his feet. "Porter won't forget this," one muttered as they backed toward the door. Jackson's expression remained impassive. "Neither will I," he replied simply. Once they were gone, he holstered his gun and turned toward the stairs, unsurprised to see Catherine standing there. "You were supposed to stay in the office," he said, though there was no real reproach in his tone. Catherine descended the stairs slowly, her heart still racing from the scene she had witnessed. "Are you hurt?" she asked, ignoring his comment. Jackson shook his head, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly. "It takes more than Porter's thugs to cause me trouble." He studied her face. "You're not frightened?" It wasn't a question, but Catherine answered anyway. "Should I be?" "Most proper young ladies from Boston would be fainting or fleeing by now," Jackson observed, moving behind the bar to pour himself a small measure of whiskey. He offered the glass to Catherine, who hesitated only briefly before accepting it. The liquor burned a path down her throat, making her eyes water, but she refused to cough or sputter. Jackson watched her with undisguised amusement. "William Foster's going to have his hands full with you, isn't he?" Catherine returned the empty glass to the bar, feeling a strange sense of accomplishment. "Mr. Foster believes he's marrying a respectable young woman who will be an asset to his position in the community." Jackson's blue eyes seemed to see right through her. "And is that what you believe, Miss Thornton?" Catherine opened her mouth to give the expected response, that yes, of course, she hoped to be a good wife to William, but found she couldn't form the words. "I don't know what I believe anymore," she admitted instead, surprising herself with her honesty. Jackson seemed about to respond when the saloon doors swung open again. Catherine tensed, expecting Porter's men to have returned, but instead Thomas entered, followed closely by William Foster himself. William stopped dead when he saw Catherine, his expression shifting rapidly from confusion to shock to anger. "Catherine? What on earth are you doing here?" His normally pleasant voice had risen nearly an octave. Before Catherine could answer, Jackson stepped forward. "Miss Thornton was curious about Silver Creek's establishments. I was giving her a tour of the town's oldest business." William's face flushed with indignation. "A saloon is no place for a lady, Jackson. You know that perfectly well." His gaze shifted to Catherine. "Catherine, please wait for me outside. I'll escort you back to the hotel immediately." It was not a request, but a command, spoken with the absolute certainty that she would obey. A week ago, perhaps even a day ago, she would have. Instead, Catherine straightened her shoulders and met William's gaze directly. "I appreciate your concern, William, but I'm perfectly capable of finding my own way back to the hotel when I'm ready to leave." She turned to Jackson. "Thank you for the tour, Mr. Jackson. It was most educational." Jackson's eyes gleamed with something that might have been approval. "The pleasure was mine, Miss Thornton." William looked thunderstruck. He opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again. "Catherine, you cannot seriously intend to remain here. Think of your reputation." There was genuine concern in his voice, which made Catherine feel a twinge of guilt. William was not a bad man, Just a conventional one. Perhaps you're right, she conceded after a moment. She nodded politely to Jackson. Good day, Mr. Jackson. As William ushered her toward the door, his hand firmly on her elbow, she glanced back over her shoulder. Ethan Jackson was watching her go, his expression unreadable, save for a curious intensity in those twilight blue eyes. The walk back to the hotel was conducted in tense silence, William's disapproval radiating from him in waves. Only when they reached the privacy of the hotel's small parlor did he speak. Catherine, I must insist on an explanation. What possessed you to enter that establishment? And alone, no less. His voice was controlled, but Catherine could hear the strain beneath it. She considered several possible answers. That she had been curious about the town, that she had wandered there by accident, that she hadn't realized it was inappropriate. All plausible excuses that William might accept. Instead, she chose honesty. I wanted to see it for myself, she said simply. To form my own opinions rather than accept those handed to me. Jackson's words, but they felt right on her lips. William stared at her as if she'd sprouted a second head. Form your own opinions? About a saloon? He shook his head in disbelief. Catherine, there are no opinions to form. Such places are inappropriate for ladies. That is a fact, not a matter for debate. And who decides what is appropriate for ladies, William? The question slipped out before Catherine could stop it, fueled by a frustration she hadn't realized was building inside her. The same people who decided I should marry a man I've never met? The same people who believe a woman's highest aspiration should be to run a household and attend charity meetings? William looked genuinely bewildered. I don't understand what's come over you, Catherine. Your parents assured me you were a young woman of impeccable breeding and sensibility. Yet I find you in a saloon, speaking to a man like Ethan Jackson, as if he were a social equal. Catherine felt a flare of indignation on Jackson's behalf, though she couldn't have explained why. And what sort of man is Ethan Jackson, exactly? You've hinted at unsavory rumors, but offered no specifics. William's expression darkened. He's a Confederate, for one thing. Fought against the Union. There are stories that he was involved in guerrilla activities, violent raids on civilian settlements. Catherine absorbed this information, turning it over in her mind. The Civil War had ended a decade ago, but the wounds it had left were still fresh in many hearts. Her own father had lost a brother at Gettysburg. The war is over, William, she said softly. Many men fought on both sides and have since made peace with their past. William wasn't mollified. It's more than that. After the war, Jackson was rumored to be involved with outlaw gangs in Missouri and Kansas. Bank robberies, train holdups, nothing proven, of course, or he'd be in prison. But where there's smoke, he trailed off significantly. Catherine thought of the man she had just met, his intelligence, his surprising library, the way he had handled the miners with controlled precision rather than unrestrained violence. It was difficult to reconcile William's accusations with what she had observed. But then, she had known Ethan Jackson for less than a day. I apologize for causing you concern, she said finally, deciding that further argument would only worsen the situation. It won't happen again. William's relief was palpable. I'm glad to hear it, he said, his tone warming considerably. I understand that the West must seem very different from Boston. It's natural to be curious. But Silver Creek is becoming a civilized town, Catherine. We have a school, a church, law-abiding citizens who want to raise families and build a community. Men like Jackson are remnants of a rougher past, one that Silver Creek is working hard to leave behind. He took her hand, his touch gentle. "In 2 weeks, we'll be married. I promise you a good life here, comfortable, respectable, safe." There it was again. Safe. The word that had followed Catherine from Boston to Colorado. Safety was what her parents wanted for her, what William was offering, what society deemed appropriate for a young woman of her background. Catherine squeezed William's hand, forcing a smile. "Of course, that's what I want too." The lie tasted bitter on her tongue, but she swallowed it down. What was the alternative? To reject the path laid out for her and do what? She had no money of her own, no skills that would earn her a living in this frontier town. She needed the safety that William offered. Didn't she? The next week passed in a blur of wedding preparations and social introductions. William seemed determined to integrate Catherine into Silver Creek society as quickly as possible, arranging teas and dinners where she could meet the right sort of people. Mrs. Harrington, the mayor's wife, took Catherine under her wing, filling her days with fittings for her wedding dress, discussions about the ceremony, and tours of the house that would soon be her home. It was a lovely house, 2 stories with a wide porch and large windows that let in the mountain light. William had furnished it with obvious care, combining practical frontier sturdiness with touches of Eastern refinement. Everything about it spoke of stability and prosperity. Catherine should have been delighted. Instead, she found herself standing at the windows, staring at the distant mountains and wondering what lay beyond them. At night, she dreamed of wide-open spaces and endless horizons. And sometimes, though she tried to deny it, even to herself, she dreamed of twilight blue eyes in a weathered face framed by a gray beard. She didn't see Ethan Jackson during that week, though she heard his name mentioned occasionally in hushed tones. William's description of him as a remnant of Silver Creek's past seemed accurate. The town's more prominent citizens spoke of the Silverado as an embarrassment, a reminder of the rough mining camp Silver Creek had once been. But Catherine also overheard other conversations, shopkeepers and laborers speaking of Jackson with respect, even admiration. "Never seen him turn away a miner down on his luck," one man said to another as Catherine browsed in the general store. "And remember when the Weaver boy got caught in that cave-in last winter? Jackson was the first one up at the mine with blankets and whiskey, stayed all night helping dig the boy out." The other man nodded. "And didn't charge a cent for the doctor neither. Paid Doc Marshall himself, I heard." Catherine filed these snippets away, building a more complex picture of Ethan Jackson than the one William had painted. Her curiosity grew until, the day before her wedding, Catherine found herself making an excuse to Mrs. Harrington and slipping away from yet another tea. She told herself she was just going for a walk to clear her head. The wedding arrangements were overwhelming after all, but her feet carried her unerringly toward the edge of town where the Silverado stood. It was mid-afternoon, the saloon likely to be quiet. Catherine hesitated at the corner, watching the building from a distance. What was she doing here? What did she hope to accomplish? Tomorrow she would marry William Foster and begin her new life as a respectable banker's wife. This inexplicable fascination with Ethan Jackson was inappropriate at best, potentially scandalous at worst. She was turning to leave when the saloon doors swung open and Jackson himself emerged, speaking over his shoulder to someone inside. He turned, saw her standing there, and stopped. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other across the dusty street. Then Jackson raised a hand in greeting and began walking toward her, Catherine knew she should leave, turn and walk quickly in the opposite direction. Instead, she remained rooted to the spot, watching him approach. He stopped a respectful distance away, his expression carefully neutral. "Miss Thornton, I'm surprised to see you in this part of town again." There was no judgment in his voice, only a mild curiosity. Catherine felt her cheeks warm. "I was just walking," she finished lamely, "clearing my head before the wedding." Jackson nodded, studying her face with those perceptive blue eyes. "Having second thoughts?" he asked quietly. The directness of the question startled her. "No, of course not," she stammered. "William is a good man. He'll provide a good life." Jackson's mouth curved slightly. "That wasn't what I asked." Catherine fell silent, unable to form a response that wasn't a lie. Jackson seemed to take pity on her discomfort. "Walk with me," he suggested, gesturing toward a path that led away from the main street, following the creek for which the town was named. It was a public path, visible from several buildings, but less crowded than the main street. Catherine hesitated, then nodded. They walked in silence for a few minutes, the sound of the creek filling the space between them. Finally, Catherine spoke. "William told me about your past, about the war and after." Jackson didn't seem surprised. "Foster doesn't approve of my presence in his civilized town," he said, a hint of irony in his voice. "Can't say I blame him. I'm a reminder of things he'd rather forget." Catherine glanced at him curiously. "What things?" Jackson stopped, turning to face her. "That Silver Creek was built on blood and silver, Miss Thornton. That the fortune that built that bank William's so proud of came from men who dug silver from land that wasn't theirs to take. That civilization here is a thin veneer over a violent history." It was the longest speech she had heard from him, delivered with a quiet intensity that made her shiver despite the warm afternoon sun. "You fought for the Confederacy," she said. It wasn't a question, but Jackson nodded anyway. "I did. Not for slavery. Never owned a slave. Never wanted to. Fought for states' rights, or so I told myself at the time." His expression was grim. "Was wrong about that, though it took me years to admit it. War has a way of stripping away your illusions, if you live long enough." Catherine had never heard anyone speak so frankly about the war. In Boston, even a decade later, it was discussed in careful terms, with firm divisions between heroes and villains. Jackson's perspective was more nuanced, more honest. "And after the war?" she asked, remembering William's accusations. "Were you an outlaw?" Jackson's eyes met hers directly. "For a time," he admitted. "When the war ended, I had nothing left. No home, no family, no purpose. Fell in with men who were angry at the world, did things I'm not proud of." Catherine should have been appalled. Instead, she found herself wanting to understand. What changed? Jackson gestured toward the creek beside them, its clear water tumbling over rocks worn smooth by time. "Found my way here 15 years ago, during the first silver strike. Made some money, lost most of it. Then realized something." He paused, his gaze distant as if looking into the past. "I was tired of destruction. Wanted to build something instead." He looked back at Catherine, his expression suddenly wry. "So I built a saloon. Not exactly a church, but it was mine, and I made some rules. No cheating, no harassing the girls who work there, no fighting unless someone truly deserves it. Found I had a talent for keeping order without a badge." There was a quiet pride in his voice that Catherine couldn't help but respond to. "The people here respect you," she said. "The working people, I mean. I've heard them talk." "Respect's earned out here," Jackson replied. "Not given because of your clothes or your bank account, or who your daddy was back east. There was no mistaking the subtle dig at William, but Catherine couldn't find it in herself to be offended. Wasn't that precisely what had begun to chafe in her own life? The automatic respect and deference given to her family name rather than to her as a person? They had reached a bend in the creek where a fallen tree created a natural bench overlooking the water. Jackson gestured toward it. "May I?" Catherine nodded, and they sat side by side, watching the play of light on the flowing water. "Why are you marrying Foster?" Jackson asked abruptly. The question shouldn't have surprised her, given his direct nature, but Catherine still found herself momentarily speechless. When she finally answered, the truth spilled out. "Because it's expected. Because my parents arranged it. Because I don't know what else to do." The admission hung in the air between them, more revealing than Catherine had intended. Jackson was silent for a long moment. "The West isn't kind to women alone," he said finally. "Can't blame you for choosing security." There was something in his tone, not quite disappointment, but something close to it, that made Catherine defensive. "What would you suggest instead, Mr. Jackson? That I reject William's proposal and do what? Work in a saloon? Become a laundress? Take in sewing?" Her voice rose slightly with each question. "I have no practical skills, no money of my own. My parents would disown me. I would be completely alone." Jackson turned to look at her, his expression serious. "You're right," he said simply. "Those are all valid concerns. Security is a powerful motivator." He stood, offering his hand to help her up. "I should get you back to town before you're missed." The walk back was conducted in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. As they approached the main street, Jackson spoke. "For what it's worth, Miss Thornton, I think you underestimate yourself. You're stronger than you know." Catherine looked up at him, startled by the unexpected compliment. There was no mockery in his face, only a quiet certainty that made her heart beat faster. "Thank you, Mr. Jackson," she managed to say. They had reached the point where their paths would diverge, he back to the Silverado, she to the hotel. "I wish you happiness in your marriage," Jackson said formally. "William Foster is a fortunate man." He tipped his hat slightly and turned to go. Catherine watched him walk away, feeling as though something important had just slipped through her fingers. "Mr. Jackson," she called impulsively. He stopped, looking back at her. "Will you come to the wedding, tomorrow at the church, 10 o'clock? The invitation surprised them both. Jackson's expression was unreadable. "I don't think Foster would appreciate my presence," he said after a moment. Catherine lifted her chin. "I'm inviting you," she said, with more boldness than she felt. "It's my wedding too." Something flickered in Jackson's eyes, amusement perhaps, or admiration. "In that case, Miss Thornton, I'll consider it." With a final nod, he continued on his way, leaving Catherine with a strange mixture of anticipation and dread. What had possessed her to invite him? William would be furious. The entire town would gossip. And yet, the thought of Ethan Jackson witnessing her marriage to William Foster filled her with an emotion she couldn't, or wouldn't, name. She turned and walked quickly toward the hotel, telling herself firmly that it didn't matter whether he came or not. Tomorrow she would become Mrs. William Foster. And this inexplicable fascination with a gray-bearded former rebel would be put firmly behind her. Tomorrow she would embrace the safe, secure future that awaited her. Tomorrow. Morning dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect Colorado day that seemed designed for beginnings. Catherine stood before the mirror in her hotel room, examining her reflection. The wedding dress was beautiful, cream-colored silk with delicate lace trim, shipped from Denver at William's expense. Her hair was arranged in an elegant updo, adorned with small white flowers. She looked every inch the proper bride. Why, then, did she feel as though she was looking at a stranger? A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, expecting Mrs. Harrington, who had appointed herself unofficial matron of honor. Instead, the door opened to reveal a young girl Catherine recognized as the hotel owner's daughter, clutching a small package. "This came for you, Miss Thornton," the girl said shyly, holding out the package. "A man asked me to deliver it privately." Catherine thanked her, waiting until the door closed before examining the unexpected delivery. It was wrapped in plain brown paper, tied with string, with no card or note visible. Curiosity overcoming caution, Catherine untied the string and unwrapped the paper. Inside was a small book bound in worn leather. The collected poems of Emily Dickinson, she read aloud, surprised. She opened the cover and found a folded piece of paper tucked inside. The handwriting was bold and masculine, but surprisingly elegant. "Miss Thornton, a wedding gift. You mentioned your mother finds Moby Dick inappropriate for young ladies. I suspect she would have similar opinions about Miss Dickinson. A rebellious poet for a woman with rebellion in her heart. E.J." Catherine's hands trembled slightly as she read the note. She opened the book randomly, her eyes falling on a poem she had never read before. "The heart asks pleasure first, and then excuse from pain, and then those little anodynes that deaden suffering, and then to go to sleep, and then, if it should be, the will of its inquisitor, the liberty to die." The words struck Catherine like a physical blow. Pleasure first, before duty, before expectation, before the deadening of feeling that she had always accepted as inevitable. She turned to another page. Wild nights, were I with thee, wild nights should be our luxury." Heat rose to her cheeks at the passionate words, so at odds with the prim image of a poet she had imagined. Another turn of the page. "I'm nobody. Who are you? Are you nobody too? Then there's a pair of us." Catherine closed the book carefully, her mind racing. How had Jackson known to choose this of all gifts? How had he sensed the part of her that resonated with these words? Words that spoke of rebellion, of passion, of choosing a different path. She tucked the book and note under her pillow, out of sight. Later, she would think about what it meant. Now, she had a wedding to prepare for. The church was filled to capacity when Catherine arrived. It seemed that all of Silver Creek had turned out to witness the marriage of their prominent banker to the Eastern bride. William stood at the altar, handsome in his black suit, his face lighting up as Catherine began her walk down the aisle on the arm of the mayor, who had volunteered to stand in for her absent father. Catherine forced herself to smile, to look appropriately radiant as every eye in the church followed her progress. Her gaze swept over the congregation, familiar faces from the week of socializing, strangers who had come out of curiosity, Mrs. Harrington beaming with pride at her matchmaking success, and there, in the last pew, partially hidden in shadow, sat Ethan Jackson. He wasn't dressed in his usual attire, but wore a well-cut black coat that must have been saved for special occasions. Their eyes met briefly as she passed, and Catherine felt a jolt of something that made her steps falter momentarily. Then she was at the altar, placing her hand in William's, turning to face the minister. The ceremony proceeded as planned. The minister spoke of duty and commitment, of building a life together in this new community. William's responses were clear and confident. his expression one of appropriate solemnity, mixed with evident satisfaction. When it came time for Catherine to speak her vows, she opened her mouth and found the words stuck in her throat. "Catherine?" William prompted gently, a flicker of concern crossing his face. The church was silent, the assembled guests holding their collective breath. Catherine tried again. Her gaze drifted past William to the back of the church, where Ethan Jackson sat watching her with those intense blue eyes. Not judging, not expecting, just watching, waiting to see what she would do. The realization hit her with sudden clarity. This was her life, her choice. Not her parents', not William's, not society's. Hers. And once made, it would determine everything that followed. Would she choose safety and security, knowing that a part of her would always wonder? Or would she choose the unknown, the uncertain, the potentially dangerous path that beckoned? "I cannot," Catherine said, her voice barely audible at first, then stronger. "I cannot do this." William's face registered shock, then disbelief. "Catherine, what are you saying?" The murmur of the congregation rose like a wave behind them. Catherine stepped back, removing her hand from William's. "I'm sorry, William. You are a good man, and you deserve a wife who truly wants the life you're offering. But that isn't me." She turned to face the stunned congregation. "I apologize for the inconvenience and embarrassment I've caused." Then, before anyone could react, Catherine gathered her skirts and walked back down the aisle, her pace steady and deliberate. As she passed the last pew, she did not look at Jackson. She did not stop until she was outside the church, standing in the bright Colorado sunshine, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and exhilaration. What had she done? What would she do now? She had no plan, no destination in mind. She simply walked, leaving the church and the murmur of shocked voices behind her. Her feet carried her through the town, past curious stares and whispered comments, until she found herself on the path by the creek where she had walked with Jackson the day before. There she stopped, sinking onto the fallen log, her wedding dress spreading around her in a pool of cream-colored silk. What now? She had rejected the safety of marriage to William. Her parents would be furious when they received the telegram she would have to send. She had no means of supporting herself, no skills that would earn her a living in this frontier town. She had acted on impulse, on feeling, without considering the practical consequences. It was the most reckless thing she had ever done. And yet, beneath the fear and uncertainty, Catherine felt something she had not expected: relief. As if a weight she hadn't fully acknowledged had been lifted from her shoulders. She took a deep breath of the clear mountain air, feeling it fill her lungs, feeling truly alive for perhaps the first time in her life. "Bold move, Miss Thornton." The voice came from behind her. Catherine didn't turn, didn't need to. She had known, somehow, that he would find her here. Ethan Jackson moved into view, still wearing the black coat from the church. "Word travels fast in a small town," he said, answering her unspoken question. Half the congregation is still standing in front of the church, trying to make sense of what happened. The other half is at the Silverado, drinking to your health or William's, depending on their loyalties. Despite everything, Catherine found herself smiling at the image. "And which are you drinking to, Mr. Jackson?" she asked, looking up at him. He met her gaze steadily. "Neither," he said. "I came to see if you were all right." The simple statement, free of judgment or expectation, touched Catherine deeply. "I don't know," she admitted. "I don't know what happens next." Jackson sat beside her on the log, maintaining a respectful distance. "What do you want to happen next?" he asked. Catherine laughed, a slightly hysterical edge to the sound. "I have no idea. I've always done what was expected of me, followed the path laid out by my parents, by society, until today." Jackson nodded, his expression thoughtful. "First taste of freedom can be overwhelming," he said. "Like a wild horse that's never been ridden, doesn't know which way to run once the corral gate is open." The analogy was apt. Catherine did feel like that wild horse, suddenly free but directionless. "I have no money," she said, thinking aloud. "No family here. No skills to earn a living. I could telegraph my parents, but they would simply insist I go through with the wedding or return to Boston in disgrace." She looked down at her hands, still clutching the small bouquet of wildflowers she had carried down the aisle. "I've made a terrible mistake, haven't I?" "That depends on your definition of a mistake," Jackson replied. "Sometimes the right choice is the hardest one." He was silent for a moment, then added, "For what it's worth, I think you're braver than most men I've known, and I've known some brave ones." The compliment warmed Catherine, but it didn't solve her practical problems. "Bravery doesn't put food on the table or a roof over my head," she said ruefully. Jackson's eyes held hers. "I might have a proposition for you," he said carefully. "The Silverado does good business, but the books are a mess. I can track debts and credits in my head for the most part, but as the town grows, it's getting more complicated. I need someone who can read, write, and cipher to keep proper accounts." Catherine stared at him, not sure she had understood correctly. "Are you offering me a job at the saloon?" "As a bookkeeper," Jackson clarified, "not serving drinks or entertaining the customers. You'd have a private office, decent pay, and a room above the saloon if you want it. Respectable work, even if the location isn't what Boston society would approve of." He paused, then added with a slight smile, "Though after today, I suspect Boston society's approval isn't your highest priority." Catherine couldn't help but laugh at that. "No, I suppose it isn't." She considered his offer. Working at the Silverado, even as a bookkeeper, would scandalize the town. Mrs. Harrington and her circle would cut her dead in the street. William would be hurt and angry. But she would be independent, earning her own way. And she would be working with Ethan Jackson, the man who seemed to see her, the real her, not the proper Boston lady she had pretended to be for so long. "When would I start?" she asked finally. "Whenever you're ready," Jackson replied. "Tomorrow, next week, the job will wait." Catherine looked down at her wedding dress, then back up at the man beside her. "Tomorrow," she decided. "I'll start tomorrow." Jackson nodded, his expression giving nothing away. "I'll have the office ready." He stood, offering his hand to help her up. Catherine took it, feeling the strength in his calloused fingers. "Thank you, Mr. Jackson," she said formally, "for the opportunity, and for the book." A flicker of a smile crossed his face. "Ethan," he corrected gently. "If we're going to be working together, might as well use my given name." The invitation to familiarity sent a small thrill through Catherine. "Then you must call me Catherine," she replied. Their hands were still joined, she realized. Neither seemed in a hurry to let go. "Catherine," he said, as if testing the sound of her name on his lips. "It suits you." There was something in his voice, in the way his twilight blue eyes held hers, that made her breath catch. This was not just about a job, she realized. Not for either of them. Whatever was happening between them, this inexplicable connection, this recognition of something shared, it was just beginning. It would not be safe or predictable or approved by society. It would be challenging, perhaps even dangerous, in ways she couldn't yet imagine. But it would be real. It would be hers. Her choice, her path, her life. For the first time, Catherine felt the full weight and wonder of her freedom. She had rejected the safe husband they had promised her. Instead, she had chosen a gray-bearded rebel who made her burn with possibilities she was only beginning to understand. "Shall we head back to town?" Ethan asked, finally releasing her hand. Catherine nodded, turning to walk beside him towards Silver Creek and whatever future awaited them there. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.